Good evening, traveler. Welcome to Lanterns of Time, where history slows down, softens, and becomes a place you can rest inside for a while. Before we begin tonight's journey, take a moment to settle wherever you are. Let the noise of the day drift a little farther away. And if you'd like, tell me where you're listening from and what time it is for you. It's always a quiet pleasure to know these stories are traveling across the world. When you're ready, let us step back, not just before pyramids, not just before pharaohs, but before Egypt itself. Long before towering monuments rose from the desert, before hieroglyphs filled temple walls, before kings wore the crowns of Upper and Lower Egypt, there was only a river flowing through an endless landscape of sand and stone. That river was the Nile. It did not build a civilization overnight. It returned season after season, bringing fertile soil, fresh water, and a rhythm that peoples slowly learned to trust. Along its banks, scattered communities settled, planted crops, crafted tools, traded with their neighbors, and discovered that cooperation could accomplish more than any one family alone. The Egypt we remember did not begin with great rulers or mighty armies. It began with ordinary people, farmers watching the floodwaters rise, fishermen casting nets into quiet waters, artisans shaping clay beneath the afternoon sun, and families passing knowledge from one generation to the next. Tonight we follow that remarkable transformation. We'll watch wandering communities become permanent villages, villages grow into thriving settlements, and those settlements slowly weave themselves into one of history's greatest civilizations. Along the way, we'll witness the first signs of writing, trade, belief, leadership, and the long road toward the unification of Upper and Lower Egypt. This is not a story of sudden triumph. Like the Nile itself, it unfolds patiently, one season at a time. So let your breathing slow. Let the modern world fade into the distance, and together we'll return to the river where ancient Egypt quietly began. Long before pharaohs shaped the world with decree and stone, before scribes inked the first lines of history, the Nile Valley was a place of wandering feet and shifting camps. The desert was wider then, a restless expanse of wind and heat. But the river and its floodplain held something different, something gentler, something alive. Archaeologists call this age Predynastic Egypt, but the people living in those days had no name for it. They lived by the sun, by the river's rise, and by the lessons carried quietly from one generation to the next. Picture the land as it was. A mosaic of shallow lakes, green patches along the Nile, and distant dunes shimmering in the heat. Animals grazed along the riverbank at dusk. Antelopes stepping carefully among reeds, hippos surfacing with slow, rolling breaths, birds rising in clouds when the wind brushed the water. Small bands of people moved through this landscape, following the seasons, gathering roots, nuts, wild grains, learning which plants healed and which ones harmed. They watched the river more carefully than anything else. It fed them, threatened them, and taught them to understand cycles, the way water rises, the way earth dries, the way life returns. And slowly, with patience shaped by generations, they stopped wandering. They stopped because the land began to speak to them, not with words, but with patterns. The river rose at nearly the same time each year. Its waters spread gently across the floodplain, leaving behind a thin, dark layer of silt richer than anything the desert could offer. Seeds thrown into this soil seemed almost eager to grow. Grains swayed in the wind long before other ancient regions mastered farming. The land, in its quiet way, invited people to stay. So they stayed. Clusters of huts formed near the river's bends, each one shaped from reeds, mud, and sun-dried clay. Children played in the shallows. Women tended clay ovens. Men napped flint into knives and arrowheads, shaping tools that would survive thousands of years. Dogs trotted between hearths, searching for scraps. The air smelled of baked grain, crushed herbs, and warm earth cooling under evening light. Night came softly in those early villages. There was no rush to end the day. People sat beside small fires, sharpening blades, repairing nets, telling stories about animals, spirits, ancestors. The river made its own quiet music, lapping gently against the shore, whispering through reeds. And above everything stretched a sky so vast and so crowded with stars that it felt almost close enough to touch. These were the first Egyptians. Not yet bound to kings or temples, not yet building monuments to last forever, but already living in harmony with a land that would shape them more deeply than they could ever know. The world around them was changing too. Rains across Africa shifted. The desert spread, turning old grasslands into sand. Animals moved toward the river, and people followed, drawn to the dependable water, the dependable soil, the dependable rhythm. Dependability became comfort. Comfort became memory. Memory became tradition. And something subtle began to awaken. Different villages, separated by distance, began to share shapes, patterns, tools. A certain curve of pottery appeared from one region to another. A certain style of bead, carved from bone or shell, traveled between families. Ideas spread as gently as the river's current. And through these small exchanges, a culture began to form. They didn't call it Egypt. They didn't know they were building a civilization. They were simply living, and through living, they laid the foundation of one of the greatest cultures the world has ever known. As decades slipped into centuries, the people along the Nile learned to read the world with increasing clarity. They knew when birds migrated, when plants sprouted, when fish gathered in deep pools. They learned where to dig canals, where to build homes safe from floods, where to store grain away from hungry animals and wandering thieves. They learned, above all, that survival came from balance, from listening to the land instead of forcing it to obey. This understanding seeped slowly into their beliefs, their customs, their way of speaking. It was the earliest seed of an idea that would one day blossom into Ma'at, the Egyptian principle of harmony, truth, and rightful order, but that would come later. For now, the people simply lived within a world where order felt natural and imbalance felt like danger. Each year the river rose, each year the people waited, and each year life returned. Over time, the villages grew, paths appeared between them. Trade began, tiny at first, a pot for a knife, fish for grain, but enough to tie communities together. Children born in one settlement might grow up and marry into another. Stories traveled, songs traveled, tools traveled, and where tools travel, ideas always follow. Slowly, quietly, these scattered communities began to form a tapestry, a culture with patterns, habits, and shared ways of seeing the world. The land was waking, so were its people. They stood at the threshold of something larger than themselves. They could not know what waited in the centuries ahead. The temples, the stone cities, the kings whose names would echo for millennia. They only knew the river, their tasks, their families, and the steady rhythm of the world they trusted. But from these humble rhythms, a great civilization was beginning to stir, not with sudden brilliance, not with war or triumph, but with the soft, patient rise of a land learning to become more than a riverbank, more than a group of villages, more than a collection of stories shared beside firelight. Egypt was awakening. And with the dawn of that awakening, the first faint outlines of a civilization appeared. Fragile, human, shaped by hands that would never know how far their world would one day reach. They learned that the Nile was not merely a river, but a teacher. and like all good teachers, it offered its lessons slowly. The rising of the waters was its first and most enduring lesson. The people watched as the river swelled with rains falling far to the south. Rains they would never see, from lands they would never visit. Yet those distant storms determined their future, their calendars, their festivals, their harvests, and eventually their gods all grew from this single, dependable miracle. The swelling was not sudden. It crept upward day by day, seeping into cracks, spreading beneath reeds, turning dust into mud, and mud into dark, fertile soil. Fish swam into the shallows. Birds circled overhead. The air thickened with humidity, and the smell of life returning rose like incense from the riverbanks. And then, as quietly as it came, the water retreated. In its wake, it left a gift. A thin layer of black silt so rich that seeds seemed to leap upward the moment they touched it. More than anything else, this cycle gave the early Egyptians a sense of time that was both steady and eternal. Akhet, the season of flood. Peret, the season of growth. Shemu, the season of harvest. 3 simple rhythms, 3 gentle movements of a world in balance. The people could not write the names yet, but they lived them so deeply that they understood time not as numbers, but as pulses. This natural calendar shaped everything. The tools they made, the homes they built, the way they stored food, even the way they prayed. At night, families gathered outside their huts to watch the heavens, not to divine omens, but to keep track of patterns. They noticed that one star, a bright, piercing point of light, rose just before the sun right as the floodwaters approached. They learned her name much later. Sopdet, Sirius, the star that heralded life. But even before she had a name, her meaning was understood. When she gleamed low on the horizon, the people knew the river would soon rise. Her appearance became a whisper of hope, and eventually a symbol woven into myths and stories. The ancient world was full of uncertainty. Storms, droughts, animals, and shifting lands plagued many early peoples. But for the communities along the Nile, the river's soft, predictable rhythm offered a rare kind of peace. It allowed them to plan, to build, to dream, to imagine that tomorrow might look much like today, but just a little better. Patterns became comfort, comfort became confidence, confidence became the foundation of civilization. As the centuries passed, villages expanded into larger communities. Narrow footpaths widened into well-trodden routes used by traders, herders, and craftsmen. Boats carved from single trunks of acacia wood glided quietly across the river, carrying baskets of grain, jars of beer, nets heavy with fish. The people learned to work together on ever larger tasks, digging canals, building storage pits lined with clay, raising small shrines where offerings of grain, beads, or carved figurines were left for unseen spirits. No one commanded these efforts. There were no kings yet, no written laws, no great monuments. But there was cooperation. There was shared memory. There was a growing understanding that life along the Nile was not merely chance. It was a partnership between people and the land. And it was here, in this partnership, that the seeds of Egypt's future greatness were sown. Slowly, leaders emerged. Not rulers, but organizers. Men and women who remembered the cycles better than others, who knew when to plant, when to harvest, when to move livestock to higher ground. Elders whose advice was trusted. Healers whose hands seemed guided by something deeper than knowledge. Craftsmen whose pottery and tools carried a subtle style that other communities admired. These were the first hints of hierarchy, not enforced by power, but given freely through respect. With respect came structure. With structure came order. With order came identity. Pottery styles shifted from simple functional shapes to graceful curves painted with spirals, animals, or river motifs. Brewers experimented with flavors, creating beers richer than those of neighboring lands. Craftsmen carved combs, beads, and pendants from ivory and bone, trading them across villages. And slowly, a shared sense of us began to take form. A people shaped not by a king, but by a river. A land awakening not in triumph or conquest, but through quiet unity. As if the Nile itself were gathering its children, guiding them gently toward a future they could not yet see. There were moments, small ones, that hinted at something larger taking shape. A burial found with beads arranged in careful patterns. A hut decorated with symbols etched into clay. A pot painted with a falcon, its wings stretched across the curve of the vessel. These gestures had no written explanation, but they spoke of meaning, of stories, beliefs, and hopes carried silently from one set of hands to another. A child might learn these patterns by watching a parent trace them in the dust. A traveler from a distant village might see the same symbol and recognize it, feeling an unexpected sense of familiarity. And through such moments, a culture, fragile but unmistakably distinct, began to emerge. Night after night, the people gathered beneath a sky so dense with stars that it seemed almost alive. They learned to read constellations not as gods yet, but as guides. The arc of Orion across the heavens, the slow turning of the seasons, the dependable rhythm of the sun returning from the horizon each morning. These patterns shaped their understanding of the world as surely as the Nile shaped their fields, and slowly they developed a worldview unlike any other. They saw the world not as chaos to be feared, but as order to be honored. Not as a place ruled by chance, but one governed by cycles, rhythms, and balance. This sense of balance began to guide their decisions. Their villages grew around the most fertile land. Their storage pits were placed at safe heights, their shrines built where the rising sun reached first. Nothing grand, nothing monumental, just choices shaped by quiet wisdom. And yet, these choices were the first steps toward what would one day become Egypt's great philosophy, Ma'at, the harmony of all things. They did not speak the word yet, but they practiced it with every task, sharing water when floods were low, sharing grain when harvests were thin, building together, mourning together, celebrating together. Balance was not imposed by rulers. It was lived collectively, and from that shared experience, the foundation of a united culture took root. Across generations, the tools grew more refined. Pottery shifted from simple bowls to beautifully burnished red jars with blackened rims that looked as if they had been dipped into night itself. Traders traveled farther along the river, bringing back shells from distant shores, pigments from desert cliffs, and stories from lands beyond the horizon. This flow of goods and ideas slowly connected communities that had once been isolated. A pot made in the south might appear in a northern village. A bead style from the delta might find its way upriver through trade or marriage. Each exchange strengthened the threads that were quietly weaving Egypt together. And though no one could see it yet, a pattern was forming, intricate, calm, and inevitable. As these connections deepened, leaders emerged with greater influence. Clan heads who coordinated harvests, priest-like figures who tended early shrines, craft masters who taught their skills to apprentices, boatsmen who ferried goods along the current. These were not rulers in the later Egyptian sense, but they were the first signs of organized society. Cooperation, once a necessity, became a strength. Strength became identity. Identity became pride. And pride, gently, quietly, became the first spark of unity. By now, the Nile Valley was changing more quickly. Villages expanded, specialized crafts flourished, communities began marking their awareness of territory, not with walls, but with shared symbols carved into pottery and tools. Certain animals took on deeper meanings. The cow for nourishment, the falcon for the sky's keen watchfulness, the serpent for protection, and the mysteries of the earth. These symbols traveled farther than the people who made them. They became threads of a cultural language spoken not with words, but with shapes and patterns repeated across hundreds of miles. And somewhere within this vast stretch of land, small centers of influence began to form. Proto-towns with more elaborate burials, larger workshops, and more active trade. The earliest craft centers emerged in Upper Egypt, while the Delta cultivated its own distinct traditions. Different environments, different resources, different rhythms of life, yet all bound by the same river. The land was no longer merely waking, it was stretching, gathering strength, learning the shape of what it would one day become. And in this long, quiet transformation, the people along the Nile were slowly learning something profound, that they were no longer just villagers or clans, but participants in a shared world, a world defined by the river that sustained them, the sky that guided them, and the ideas growing silently in their hands. The stage was set, the patterns were in place, the land had opened its eyes. Egypt was ready to rise. The river did more than feed the soil. It taught the people how to mark the passing of seasons long before they understood the notion of years. The earliest farmers stood at the riverbank each morning, measuring the floodplain with their eyes, checking where the waterline rested, how fast it was rising, whether the color of the current hinted at distant rains. They learned to read the river as one might read the face of a trusted elder, each change subtle yet full of meaning. In time, they learned that the Nile's behavior followed a pattern so precise it bordered on miracle. When the flood arrived, it did not roar or surge violently. It crept outward in a slow, dignified swell, spreading across the land as though unrolling a great sheet of glassy water. Fields disappeared beneath its surface. Paths vanished. Trees stood knee-deep in the rising tide, their reflections trembling gently with each passing breeze. From a distance, the valley looked like a calm inland sea, broken only by the tops of huts, the tips of acacia trees, and the silhouettes of fishermen guiding their boats in silence. Life did not stop during the flood. It simply shifted. Children swam in shallow waters. Women washed pottery and soaked reeds for weaving. Men ventured out in boats, casting nets that shivered beneath the surface. The world felt suspended, as if held in a brief, shimmering breath before the land returned. Then, after weeks of patient waiting, the water began to retreat. Slowly, steadily, respectfully, it withdrew into the riverbed, revealing soil so dark and so rich that it seemed to glow under the morning sun. Farmers touched the damp earth with gratitude. They broke it open with wooden plows, scattering seeds into the soft, welcoming ground. Birds gathered along the furrows, picking at stray grains. Dogs trotted between plots, chasing the occasional lizard that dared to dart across the fields. And as green shoots emerged, the river receded further, settling into its dry season form, skinnier, quieter, a faint whisper of the greatness it had displayed only weeks before. This three-part rhythm, flood, growth, harvest, became the backbone of Egyptian life. Akhet, Peret, Shemu. Long before scribes inked these names onto papyrus, the people felt them in their bones. They planted when the earth told them to plant. They harvested when the stalks bent under their own weight. They stored grain in cool pits carved deep into the ground, sealed with woven lids to keep out moisture and hungry creatures. The land offered, and the people answered. But even this dependable cycle was not the Nile's only gift. On quiet nights, when the air cooled and the fires dimmed, families looked upward. Parents pointed to stars that drifted across the sky. Children traced their shapes with small, curious fingers, and with time, patterns emerged. One star in particular seemed to hold special importance. She disappeared for months, only to reappear just before dawn, at the precise moment the river began to swell. She returned with the promise of life. We know her today as Sirius Sopdet, the brightest star in the night sky. But to the people along the Nile, she was a herald, a messenger, a quiet announcement that the world was renewing itself once again. The rising of Sopdet became the first reliable celestial marker in Egyptian history. It was not worship, not yet, but reverence, a deep respect for the delicate alignment between the heavens and the earth. This connection, this sense that the cosmos itself was part of the river's rhythm, shaped the way early Egyptians viewed their world. To them, the universe was not hostile, it was not chaotic, it was not a place of sudden fury. Instead, it was balanced, ordered, a grand design in which every element had its place. And so they lived in gentle conversation with their environment. When the flood came early, they adjusted. When it came late, they adapted. They trusted the land because the land had never failed them. This trust, reinforced year after year, would become the philosophical heart of Egyptian civilization. Later, scribes would call this order Ma'at. But even in these earliest days, before ink and tablets, before kings and crowns, the people practiced its principles, honoring cycles, preserving harmony, seeking balance in every task. And as they learned to master the river's gifts, they also learned to shape the land itself. Shallow canals were carved by hand to guide receding water across fields. Simple dikes were built from mud and reed bundles to control the low floods. Communities gathered each season to repair banks and clear channels, singing work songs that echoed across the valley. Children carried handfuls of seeds, dropping them one by one into the earth. Elders oversaw the work, watching for signs in the soil. Farmers marked territories not with fences, but with clusters of trees whose positions told neighbors where one field ended and another began. Nothing was rushed, nothing was forced. The land set the pace, the people followed. In this slow, deliberate dance between water and earth, the earliest structure of Egyptian society took root. And though these people did not yet know it, they were crafting more than fields. They were crafting identity, a shared understanding of the world that would one day bind millions across centuries. Egypt was still young, still quiet, still forming in the hands of farmers and fishermen, potters and herders, sky watchers and storytellers. Yet even now, its rise had begun. As the centuries unfolded, these early river communities began to push gently beyond survival and into something deeper. A sense of place, a sense of belonging, a sense that the land beneath their feet was more than soil. It was home. Homes changed with this realization. Where once families built simple reed shelters meant to last only a season, they now shaped sturdier walls from mud brick dried in the heat of the sun. Floors were smoothed with clay. Small ovens appeared beside doorways, their rounded bellies glowing orange at dusk as bread baked inside. Storage pits multiplied, lined carefully with baskets or fibers to protect precious grain. Domestic life became richer. A child might wake to the smell of baking wheat. A mother might grind emmer on a stone slab, the rhythmic sound echoing softly in the quiet morning. In the evenings, families gathered around low fires to share simple meals. Fish grilled over embers, stews flavored with herbs, flatbread torn and passed from hand to hand. the soft hum of daily life began to fill the Nile Valley. Farming tasks grew more organized. Villages developed routines that aligned not just with the seasons, but with the needs of the community. One group might tend to cattle, another prepared fields for planting, others shaped pottery, or crafted nets, or built tools, or gathered reeds for weaving. Skill became identity. Identity became tradition. Tradition became pride. And pride, as always, found ways to express itself. Pottery from these early centuries was no longer simply functional. The shapes became elegant, the clay more carefully selected, the paint more deliberate. Red polished jars gleamed in the firelight, their glossy surfaces reflecting dancing shadows. Black-topped vessels fired upside down in smothered flames looked like dusk captured in clay. Some pots bore scenes of river animals, hippos drifting through reeds, birds lifting into the sky, fish darting beneath the surface of painted waves. Others displayed geometric symbols, spirals, lines, diamond patterns that might have carried stories or clan identities, or simply the quiet satisfaction of creation. In these designs, we see the earliest evidence of a people beginning to define themselves. Tools also evolved. The familiar flint blades remained, but craftsmen learned to pressure flake edges to a razor sharpness. Some pieces were so finely shaped that they seemed closer to art than utility. Bone needles grew slender and more precise. Combs carved from ivory showed notched teeth and curved tops that hinted at aesthetic sensibilities far beyond mere necessity. As craftsmanship grew, so did trade. Boats skimmed along the river carrying pots, beads, and polished stone. Caravans ventured cautiously into desert routes, exchanging goods with neighboring peoples. Nubian traders brought ivory and gold from the south. Desert nomads carried exotic stones and pigments, and from the Mediterranean coast, shells and unique fish bones appeared in burials far inland. These exchanges, quiet, steady, uncelebrated, slowly tied distant communities together with threads of shared material culture. The villages were no longer isolated worlds. They were pieces of a larger mosaic, a land subtly knitting itself into something greater. Even beliefs began to shift. In the earliest days, people honored spirits of land and water in simple gestures. A bowl of grain left at the river's edge, a carved figurine placed near a hearth, a whispered hope directed at the stars. But with time, their ideas grew more structured. Animals took on symbolic roles. The cow became a nurturing presence, the giver of milk, warmth, and life. The falcon came to embody the sky's sharp clarity, the watcher who misses nothing. The serpent symbolized rebirth, shedding skin to begin anew. These meanings traveled from one village to another, crossing the valley like seeds carried by wind. And as meanings traveled, so did faith. Simple shrines appeared, made of reeds or wood, decorated with pigments taken from ochre beds or desert cliffs. Inside these small sacred spaces, offerings accumulated: bread, beads, feathers, small vessels shaped with care. Priest-like figures began to emerge. Not yet clergy as we know them, but individuals who tended shrines, remembered rituals, and led quiet ceremonies that marked the turning of seasons, or honored ancestors, or asked the river for its continued blessing. In these early rituals, we see the first faint outlines of what would one day become the elaborate religious system of ancient Egypt. And beyond rituals, something else stirred, something subtle, something philosophical. The people sensed that their world was governed by balance, the balance of flood and drought, of day and night, of growth and decay, of order and uncertainty. They began to associate harmony with survival. Disorder, even in small forms, felt like danger. a poorly timed harvest, a broken irrigation ditch, a forgotten ritual. These actions seemed to ripple outward, unsettling the delicate rhythm that life depended upon. This awareness, this quiet devotion to order, would one day crystallize into one of Egypt's greatest ideas, Ma'at. But for now, it simply lived in their choices. And as their choices shaped their world, the Nile Valley was slowly becoming something new. A land no longer defined solely by nature, but by the people who walked its banks and learned to live within its rhythm. Village by village, season by season, story by story, Egypt was rising. Not in a rush, not in a blaze of glory, but in a calm, steady unfolding, as natural as the river itself. With each passing century, the quiet connections between villages grew stronger. Paths that once served a handful of travelers became well-trodden routes lined with clusters of reeds, and footprints, hardened by sunboats, drifted more frequently along the river, carrying clay jars filled with grain, bundles of linen, and small treasures carved from bone or ivory. The river was no longer only a provider. It had become a highway. Its steady current pulled distant communities closer, not only in trade, but in ideas. Symbols seen in one region, a spiral painted on pottery, a bird etched into a blade handle, began appearing in another cloth patterns. Bead styles, even hairstyles traveled along the water's path. Slowly, the Nile was becoming the spine of a shared culture. The people did not recognize this shift. They couldn't know they were laying the tracks for a civilization that would last 3,000 years. They only knew that their world was becoming more connected, more familiar, more unified. And as these cultural threads grew denser, a new kind of settlement emerged. One larger, more structured, more influential than the small river villages. These proto-towns rose first in Upper Egypt. Places like Hierakonpolis and Nakada expanded from clusters of huts to thriving centers of craft and trade workshops lined the riverbanks. Potters shaped elegant vessels whose surfaces gleamed like polished stone. Weavers produced fine linen so smooth and tightly woven that it whispered when handled. Burials in these towns became more elaborate. Graves dug into sandy hillsides contained beads of foreign origin, cosmetic palettes carved from slate, and tiny amulets shaped like animals or abstract symbols. These grave goods did not signal wealth so much as meaning, proof that the people who lived here had begun to see life and death as part of a larger story. Leaders emerged not through conquest, but through guidance. Individuals who coordinated seasonal labor, mediated disputes, and organized the construction of communal facilities. They held no crowns, no titles, no thrones, but respect gathered around them like the soft glow of morning sun spreading across the floodplain. In the delta, Lower Egypt developed differently. Marshlands shaped their world, with fishing, reed gathering, and waterfowl hunting at the center of daily life. Villages perched on raised mounds protected themselves from floods. Houses made of tightly bundled papyrus rose above wetlands like woven sculptures. Boats were everywhere. Simple skiffs carved from tree trunks, and larger vessels woven from papyrus stalks that skimmed lightly over shallow water. Trade flowed northward toward the Mediterranean, bringing new materials and influences that did not reach the south. Shells, pigments, rare fish bones appeared in delta burials, marking the region's distinctive identity. Two lands, two ways of life, two developing cultures, yet both shaped by the same river. Upper Egypt, with its dry cliffs, its broad stretches of rocky desert, its villages clustered along narrow strips of farmland. Lower Egypt, with its marshes, its tangled waterways, its wide, fertile floodplain. The people of the south looked toward Nubia and the desert, The people of the north looked toward the Mediterranean and the Levant. These different horizons shaped different traditions. Yet the river flowed through both, binding them with a thread that neither fully understood. The differences between north and south were not hostile at first. They were simply natural variations in a land that stretched hundreds of miles. But over time, as each region grew stronger, the differences sharpened, pottery styles diverged, burial customs shifted. Artistic motifs, once shared across the valley, took on regional flavors. And beneath these subtle changes, a quiet tension grew. Not war, not conflict. Just the awareness that each region moved with its own rhythm, its own pride, its own story. Upper Egypt, stretched along a narrow valley, developed a fierce unity forged by proximity and shared struggle. Lower Egypt, spread wide across marsh and delta, formed networks built on abundance and diversity. Neither region intended to dominate the other. But the river, with its long, unbroken path, encouraged connection. And where connection grows, so too does comparison. Some communities in the south began carving symbols on pallets, signs of power, of lineage, of territory. Others painted boats with raised prows carrying figures who might have been chiefs or ancestors or spirits. In the north, marsh symbols appeared: papyrus stalks, birds, fish. Shrines adorned with reed bundles gleamed faintly in the morning mist. Each region expressed its identity through its environment, its craft, its beliefs. And though no one yet spoke the words, the seeds of two distinct kingdoms had begun to form. Two lands, two cultures, two rising powers growing quietly beside the same river. Their paths would cross, as all paths along the Nile eventually do, and when they crossed, Egypt would change forever. But for now, in this moment of calm before unity, the two lands simply grew, each in its own way, each shaped by water and wind, each preparing unknowingly for the day when their stories would join into one. As the gulf between the northern delta and the southern valley widened, the people of each region began developing symbols of identity that went beyond pottery and burial styles. In Upper Egypt, a new emblem appeared: a tall, conical white crown crafted from leather or reeds, shaped like a tapering flame rising toward the sky. Its form was simple, but its meaning powerful. It signified leadership, guidance, and the unity of the southern people who lived along the narrow ribbon of the Nile. In Lower Egypt, a different emblem took shape: a red crown with a high back and a curling protrusion at the front, evoking the spiraling energy of marshland life. It was broad and sweeping, like the delta itself, and represented the wide expanse of fertile land that stretched toward the sea. These crowns were not yet symbols of kings in the way later Egyptians understood kingship. They were tokens of regional identity, visual expressions of how each land understood its place in the world. They signaled something subtle but profound. The south and the north no longer saw themselves merely as villages or clusters of settlements, but as distinct cultural spheres with their own leaders, their own traditions, their own ways of life. The proto-cities of Upper Egypt, Hierakonpolis, Nakada, Abydos, grew into dynamic centers of craft and ceremony. Workshops produced pottery with elegant forms and intricate decorations. Artisans carved cosmetic palettes with images of animals, boats, and geometric patterns that may have held meanings we have yet to decipher. Some palettes depicted scenes of powerful figures hunting or commanding animals, symbolic expressions of authority and mastery over the natural world. These images, appearing more frequently, hinted at a shift in social order, a growing recognition that some individuals held influence beyond daily agricultural concerns. Meanwhile, in the delta, Towns like Buto and Mendes thrived on fishing, papyrus harvesting, and trade with Mediterranean peoples. Marsh gods began to appear in their art, figures tied to waterfowl, frogs, and serpents, echoing the ecosystem that shaped their lives. Each region developed its own spiritual landscape, its own sacred animals, its own rituals. It was not conflict that divided them. It was difference. Difference born from geography, from environment, from the simple truth that the same river could give birth to contrasting worlds. But as these worlds matured, a subtle tremor of competition, a quiet tension woven through trade routes and territorial boundaries, began to ripple through the valley. It wasn't war, not yet, but it was the beginning of ambition. Ambition as soft and steady as the river's own current. Leaders in Upper Egypt, accustomed to narrow valleys and tight-knit communities, saw the advantage of unity, strength in numbers, strength in shared identity, strength in coordinated effort, especially when controlling floodwaters or defending farmland from desert encroachment. Leaders in Lower Egypt, with their broad wetlands and access to foreign trade, saw the strength of prosperity, abundance in resources, abundance in connections, abundance in cultural variety that flowed in from across the sea. Two lands, two kinds of strength, two paths shaping themselves along the same river. And beneath these natural differences, buried deep in the exchanges between villages and towns, one truth lingered. Unity was possible. Unity was approaching. We can see it now in the archaeological record, in the way pottery styles begin merging, in the shared symbols appearing on tools and palettes, in the common motifs etched into bone and ivory. Even burial styles, once distinctly northern or southern, begin showing signs of influence from one another. Trade made unity desirable. Culture made unity imaginable. Geography made unity inevitable. All that remained was a leader capable of shaping this gentle drift into a deliberate movement. And in Upper Egypt, in the growing centers along the southern Nile, such leaders were emerging. Their influence expanded quietly, first over neighboring villages, then over nearby towns, and eventually over entire stretches of the valley. Proto-chiefs became proto-kings. Their symbols grew more elaborate, their tombs more prestigious, their ceremonies more structured, and the white crown of Upper Egypt began to carry weight beyond mere identity. It began to suggest authority. Meanwhile, in the Delta, regional leaders responded in kind. They expanded their networks, strengthened trade routes, and developed rituals and symbols that affirmed their own cultural identity. The red crown became not just a regional marker, but a declaration of sovereignty. Two lands rising, two identities sharpening, two crowns gaining meaning. The river ran between them, quiet, steady, impartial, carrying boats, goods, stories, and the growing awareness that these lands were destined to meet. Their meeting would not be swift. It would not be a single battle or a single event. It would be a long, slow merging of culture, economy, belief, and will. But when the meeting finally came, when the South and the North recognized that two crowns could become one, Egypt, as the world would one day know it, was born. The transformation toward unity did not begin with armies. It began with symbols. Cosmetic palettes, once simple tools used for grinding pigments, became canvases for imagery that carried layered meanings. Animals once painted in motion, antelopes, ostriches, crocodiles, were now arranged in compositions that suggested order, hierarchy, perhaps even myth. Boats, too, took on new significance. Some were painted with raised prow and stern, their silhouettes sharp and proud, as though representing not a simple fishing vessel, but something ceremonial, something meant to carry spirits or leaders across worlds both seen and unseen. On certain pallets unearthed from the sands, we see two animals locked in symmetrical struggle. Creatures with intertwining necks, mirrored forms, perfectly balanced. Whether these scenes represented conflict, harmony, or cosmology, we cannot be certain, but we can see the intention behind them, a shift from mere decoration to storytelling. And in a land where writing had not yet taken form, these images were stories. Stories carried in the hands of leaders, in the rituals of ceremonies, in the memories of those who shaped them. In Upper Egypt, these symbolic objects became more concentrated in the towns that dominated the region: Hierakonpolis, Nakada, and Abydos. These places began producing not only tools and pottery, but identity. They crafted the visual language of a growing southern power. Leaders from these regions did not yet rule a kingdom, but they began to command respect across distances. Their authority spread not through force, but through influence, a network of alliances, marriages, trade relations, and shared ritual practices. As influence grew, the river whispered its quiet encouragement. Its current connected every village on its banks, pulling distant communities closer in the same way that the moon pulled at its surface. In this world, a world where cooperation meant survival, leadership mattered. And in Upper Egypt, leaders were beginning to rise who understood that a unified valley was stronger than a patchwork of independent villages. These early southern rulers began organizing labor on a larger scale. Irrigation systems expanded, granaries grew taller. Trade expeditions pushed further into Nubia, bringing back gold, incense, carved ivory, and exotic stones that carried prestige. Prestige in these early centuries was power, and as power collected in the south, the idea of unity began to take shape, not as conquest, but as possibility. Lower Egypt, with its vast wetlands and foreign connections, was no passive observer. Its communities developed their own traditions of leadership centered around trade, abundance, and sacred sites built for marsh deities. The red crown became the emblem of this identity, a declaration that the Delta was a land rich in resources and deserving of respect. Two lands, two systems, two rising identities. And somewhere along the river's winding path, the question formed, a question that no one would speak aloud, but that lingered in the spaces between communities. Could one leader unite the whole valley? The answer, as history would show, was yes. But unity did not arrive all at once. We often imagine the unification of Egypt as a single moment, a single battle, a single triumph carved into stone. But the truth was gentler, slower, more human. Villages aligned themselves first, choosing southern leaders for practical reasons: protection, organization, access to trade. Proto-chiefs built alliances with neighboring settlements, offering stability during unpredictable years. Ceremonial practices began to standardize. Art motifs spread across the valley, carrying subtle hints of the South's growing influence. And as this influence expanded, Upper Egypt gradually drew together under a single leader, a figure whose authority reached further than those who came before. We do not know his name. He lived before writing, before records, before history as we know it. But we see his trace in the wealth of certain burials, in the scale of early buildings, in the symbols carved into palettes that speak of leadership and command. He, or perhaps several leaders across generations, began to shape Upper Egypt into a unified cultural force. And as this southern unity solidified, Lower Egypt faced a choice: align, resist, or match the South's growing strength. Signs of tension appear faintly in the archaeological record: broken pallets, defensive earthworks, changes in burial practices. Nothing explicit, nothing violent, but enough to suggest that the path toward unity was neither simple nor peaceful. Still, the river flowed. Still, trade moved along its current. Still, ideas blended, merging southern and northern identities into something neither had been before. By the time the figure known as Narmer emerged, a name we now carve into the foundations of Egyptian history, the unification was already years, perhaps centuries, in motion. Narmer would be the one to complete it, but he did not begin it. He inherited the momentum of countless unnamed leaders whose quiet decisions paved the way for the creation of a single kingdom. And through these decisions, these alliances, these merging traditions, these shared symbols, Egypt drew closer to its destiny. Two lands, two crowns, two stories slowly intertwining. The moment of unity was approaching, not with thunder, but with a calm, inevitable grace, like the rising of the river itself. It happened slowly, almost imperceptibly, as though the land itself were guiding the process. Upper Egypt's unity grew firmer. Lower Egypt's networks intertwined ever more tightly. Symbols traveled up and down the river, adopted first by craftsmen, then by leaders, then by entire communities. A particular kind of palette began to appear, larger, more elaborate, carved with scenes that felt strikingly deliberate. Animals arranged in ordered procession standards, held aloft by figures who seemed to command with quiet authority. Mythical creatures, serpopards with intertwining necks, graced the stone with a symmetry that hinted at duality, at the meeting of opposites, at the merging of worlds. These images were not random, they were messages. Messages encoded in art by people on the brink of forming a nation. The river carried these palettes from one proto-town to another, and with each exchange, the shared visual language deepened. Symbols that once belonged only to the south appeared in northern settlements. Northern motifs found their way into southern workshops. Aesthetic boundaries softened, belief systems blended. Ritual practices adopted new forms. Even burial customs, those deeply personal expressions of identity, began to show the faint fingerprints of cultural merging. Red-polished pottery from the south appeared in northern graves. Papyrus-inspired motifs from the delta showed up in southern contexts. It was as if the valley, long divided by geography, was quietly preparing itself to become one. And then, somewhere along the slow drift of centuries, a southern leader stepped forward whose influence would extend further than any who came before him. He was not yet a pharaoh, that word did not exist. He was not yet a divine king. That idea had not taken shape, but he was something new. A ruler whose authority stretched across a significant portion of Upper Egypt, whose symbols traveled with caravans and boats, whose decisions shaped the lives of thousands. His name has not survived, only his impact. Under his lineage, a succession of leaders who may have shared blood or simply shared purpose, Upper Egypt became unmistakably unified. This was the final step needed before the great merging could occur. With the South consolidated, its leaders turned their attention northward, not with reckless ambition, but with the steady confidence of a people who believed that unity was both possible and inevitable. Trade agreements shifted, territorial markers changed, alliances formed and dissolved as communities across the delta negotiated their place in the new landscape of power. The archaeological record shows a subtle tightening of southern influence, distinctive pottery styles spreading northward, iconography traveling with increasing frequency, administrative objects, hinting at centralized control. But these changes occurred gradually. There is no sign of rapid conquest, no sudden destruction, no chaos carved into stone. Instead, the record suggests a long, steady blending of systems, a movement driven as much by cooperation as by conflict. And then, just as the threads of unity were nearing completion, a new leader appeared. His name was Narmer. He was the inheritor of generations of southern ambition, tradition, and growing power. He rose in a world already leaning toward unity, already shaped by shared motifs, already prepared for the idea of a single ruler over both lands. Narmer did not create this moment. He completed it. The palette that bears his name is more than a ceremonial artifact. It is the closing scene of a story centuries in the making. Two crowns, the tall white crown of the south and the sweeping red crown of the north, are united in the figure of a single ruler. On one side, Narmer stands wearing the southern crown, his posture confident, his authority clear. On the other, he wears the northern crown, declaring sovereignty over the delta. The palette depicts order, not chaos; ceremony, not destruction; the establishment of unity, not its violent achievement. It is a symbol of the moment two lands accepted a shared identity. And beneath the imagery, beneath the authority and symbolism, one message whispers through the stone: Egypt is one. With this unification, a new era dawned. The first dynasty began. Administration systems took shape. Scribes recorded tallies. Granaries were organized. Leaders became kings. Kings became symbols. And yet, even in this monumental shift, the transition felt gradual, an evolution rather than a revolution. Villages did not suddenly transform into cities. Farmers still rose before dawn to tend their fields. Mothers still baked bread in clay ovens. Fishermen still cast nets in quiet morning waters. The rhythms of the Nile continued unchanged. What changed was how those rhythms were understood. Where once the people saw only cycles, they now saw purpose. Where once they honored balance instinctively, they now honored it consciously. Where once the land was many small worlds strung like beads along a river, it was now a single tapestry woven with unity, identity, and shared belief. Egypt, the Egypt we recognize, the Egypt of crowns, gods, temples, and timeless stories, began here. Not in a moment of triumph, but in a moment of alignment. A quiet merging, a gentle rising, a soft joining of river, land, and people into one. With unity achieved, the river valley did not erupt into sudden grandeur. Instead, Egypt took its first steps into statehood with the same calm deliberation that had guided its rise from scattered villages. The first dynasty was young, its institutions still formless, its leaders still defining their roles. The idea of kingship needed time to mature, time to gather meaning, time to become more than authority and evolve into identity. The earliest kings ruled from cities whose outlines are faint now, softened by millennia of drifting sand. Abydos, perhaps the most sacred among them, became a place where rulers built their tombs, carved deep into the desert edge. These were not yet pyramids. They were mud brick structures with wooden chambers lined with goods meant to accompany the dead on a journey into the unknown. Inside these tombs, archaeologists have found rows of simple jars filled with grain or beer, bone combs, flint knives, cosmetic palettes, small figurines shaped with reverence. These were the possessions of daily life. Humble tools placed beside leaders to ensure comfort and continuity beyond the horizon of death. Death was not an ending for the early Egyptians. It was a passage, a transition, a crossing into another state of being. The desert, vast and silent, seemed the perfect threshold, a place where earth met eternity. In the living world, the newly unified kingdom began to take shape through organization. Writing emerged from earlier symbols, transforming simple marks into the first steps of hieroglyphic script. At first, these signs recorded goods, tallies of grain, inventories of livestock, accounts of labor. But slowly, this practical system became something artistic, layered with meaning. The people of the Nile began to understand that writing could preserve thought, memory, story. It could transform the fleeting moments of a life into something that would endure long after stone eroded and bodies faded into dust. Craftsmen, already skilled from centuries of practice, found new purpose in this unified world. Potters produced standardized vessels for storing offerings or transporting food. Weavers created linen of increasing fineness, so soft it almost resembled silk. Stoneworkers shaped tools with precision and carved ivory with scenes that hinted at early myths and rituals. Their hands were shaping the visual identity of a civilization. And as goods, tools, and symbols circulated from one end of the kingdom to the other, a shared culture, stronger than ever, took form. The palace emerged at the center of this system, not yet a grand architectural marvel, but a seat of administration where scribes recorded accounts, where messengers carried orders along dusty roads, where emissaries from distant regions paid respects to the new king. Kingship itself began to gather symbolic weight. No longer merely a leader of people, the king became the embodiment of unity. The living bridge between the two lands, his crowns, white and red, were no longer regional tokens, but the symbols of a single, whole Egypt. He was the one who upheld order. He was the one who enacted balance. He was the one who ensured that Ma'at prevailed over chaos. The concept of Ma'at, which had lived unspoken in the hearts of early farmers and river folk, now blossomed into a guiding principle for the entire kingdom. Ma'at was truth. Ma'at was balance. Ma'at was the natural order of things, the steady rising of the Nile, the turning of seasons, the harmony between land and people. It became the king's sacred duty to maintain this cosmic order. He was not a tyrant, but a guardian, a custodian of harmony. Later ages would exalt him as divine. But in these earliest years he was something simpler, a leader entrusted with keeping the world steady. Priests, too, found their roles expanding. Shrines that once served local spirits grew into sanctuaries dedicated to more defined deities, gods whose domains reflected the needs and values of the people. A falcon god rose in the south, watchful and commanding. A cow goddess emerged in the north, nurturing and protective. River gods, sky gods, earth gods, each took form as the Egyptians shaped their understanding of an ordered universe. Temples became more structured, still humble, still built of reed and wood, but now centers of ritual where offerings were carefully recorded, where priests tended sacred fires, where hymns were spoken in voices that sought to mirror the calm rhythm of creation. Trade expanded in all directions. Caravans crossed the desert, bringing back copper from Sinai, incense from Punt, and exotic goods from lands whose names are lost to time. Boats traveled up and down the Nile, carrying grain, linen, tools, pottery, ideas. And through these exchanges, the kingdom grew cohesive, its identity becoming firmer, its borders more defined. But perhaps the most profound change came in how the Egyptians saw themselves. They no longer lived as isolated river dwellers. They no longer defined themselves by village or region. They no longer traced identity through small cultural differences of pottery or customs. They were now part of something larger, something unified, something ancient and eternal. They were Egyptians, the people of the Black Land, the children of the Nile, the keepers of harmony. And with this new identity, forged through centuries of quiet evolution, Egypt stepped into the dawn of its oldest great era, the Old Kingdom. The age of stone, the age of pyramids, the age of permanence. The transition into the Old Kingdom did not feel sudden to the people who lived it. There was no dramatic shift, no proclamation that the world had changed. Life continued with its familiar rhythms: planting, harvesting, crafting, trading, honoring the river, honoring the sky. But beneath these everyday motions, a profound evolution was taking place. The rulers of the first dynasty had established the foundation of kingship, but it was during the early Old Kingdom that the role of the king deepened, expanding into something cosmic. He was no longer just a leader. He became a symbol, the living heart of the unified land, the earthly counterpart to the divine order above. And standing beside him, guiding his vision, was a figure whose name would echo through 4,000 years of history: Imhotep. A man of remarkable intellect, Imhotep was an architect, a priest, a physician, a philosopher. He served under King Djoser, one of the early rulers of the Old Kingdom, and he carried an idea that would transform Egypt forever. The idea was simple yet revolutionary: that stone could be shaped not merely into simple tombs, but into structures that touched eternity. Up to this point, Egyptians had built with mud brick and wood, materials shaped by the valley, materials that returned to the earth as quietly as they rose from it. But stone was different. Stone did not bend. Stone did not crumble in a single season. Stone did not fade with rain or sun. Stone promised permanence. It promised memory made solid. It promised a way for a king's legacy to stand long after his body had turned to dust. In a land governed by cycles, where the flood came and went, where life and death moved in gentle rhythm, the idea of permanence felt almost divine. And so Imhotep shaped it into reality. He built a tomb for Djoser, unlike any created before. A structure rising in stages toward the sky, layer upon layer, each tier a step leading upward from earth into eternity. The Step Pyramid at Saqqara was Egypt's first monumental stone building. It was a declaration, quiet yet unmistakable, that Egypt had entered a new age. Workers quarried limestone from cliffs overlooking the desert, shaping blocks with copper tools and wooden mallets. They hauled them across the sands with sledges and ropes, hundreds of hands moving in unison, guided by overseers who relied on generations of inherited wisdom. The desert rang with the rhythmic strike of tools, with the shouts and songs of laborers, with the creaking of wooden sledges dragged across oiled sand. But despite the effort, the atmosphere was not chaotic. It was organized, methodical, almost meditative. Building was not merely a task, it was a sacred duty, a work of devotion offered to the king, to the gods, to the idea of a world in balance. Around the Step Pyramid, a vast complex took shape. Courtyards, shrines, halls, and ceremonial spaces built of stone shaped with precision walls rose smooth and white, reflecting light in shimmering waves that made the entire complex seem to glow. To see such structures rise must have felt like witnessing the impossible. For the first time, people could look upon something that did not belong to the cycles of the river, that did not weather with each season, that did not vanish into the earth. It belonged to time itself. Stone allowed Egypt to speak across generations. And with this new power, the role of the king grew even more profound. He was no longer merely the guardian of Ma'at in life. He became the axis between worlds, the one whose death did not signal departure, but transformation. Kings were buried within stone because they were believed to journey into the next realm as intermediaries between the gods and their people. The Old Kingdom became the age of divine kingship. Priests refined rituals, shaping hymns and ceremonies that echoed the cosmic order they believed governed the universe. Temples grew more elaborate, filled with incense, offerings and sacred objects meant to maintain harmony between heaven and earth. Scribes perfected their craft. Hieroglyphs blossomed from simple tallies into a sophisticated writing system capable of capturing myth, prayer, memory, law. Words gained permanence, etched into stone, painted on walls, inked onto papyrus. Art flourished. Reliefs depicted workers, animals, harvests, rituals, boats gliding across the Nile, and scenes of daily life rendered with a softness that feels almost timeless. Identity deepened. Class structures formed, not rigidly but steadily, guided by roles that supported the growing machinery of a centralized state. Yet for all these changes, the essence of Egypt remained rooted in the land's ancient rhythms. Farmers still woke before dawn to watch the sun climb over the desert ridge. Fishermen still cast nets in the cool quiet of morning. Families still gathered at night around small fires to share the day's stories. What changed was how these everyday actions fit into a grander vision, a vision of continuity, of cosmic balance, of life stretching beyond the boundaries of any single lifetime. Egypt was no longer a collection of villages. It was no longer a valley divided by regions. It was a civilization, unified, confident, and stepping into the light of its first golden age. The land that rose from river mud was now rising toward the sky. The step pyramid stood at Saqqara like a dawn carved in stone. For travelers approaching from the desert, merchants leading caravans, farmers walking beside donkeys heavy with grain, families seeking work or blessing. The sight must have seemed unreal, a mountain built by human hands, a stairway rising in perfect lines, each layer balanced upon the last, with a calmness that echoed the very order Egypt believed in. People spoke of it in hushed tones. Some called it the ladder of the king. Some believed it was a beacon guiding the sun across the sky. Others whispered that it anchored the land itself, holding chaos at bay, ensuring that the cycles of flood and harvest would continue unchanged. Whatever meaning they carried, one truth was clear. Egypt had discovered permanence, and permanence changed everything. If stone could preserve a king, it could preserve memory. If memory could endure, then the deeds of rulers could echo through time. If kings could speak across generations, they could shape not only their own era, but the future that followed. On this foundation, Egyptian kingship evolved. Djoser's successors embraced this new language of stone. Their architects experimented with new angles, new layouts, new methods of quarrying and transport. Stone walls thickened. Tombs grew grander. Temple courtyards widened to receive processions of priests and offerings. Yet none of these early innovations matched the ambition that soon emerged from a royal court farther north. At a place called Meidum, a king, possibly Sneferu, attempted something unprecedented. A true pyramid, smooth-sided, rising not in steps, but in a continuous plane from earth to heaven. The attempt faltered. The structure may have collapsed during or shortly after construction. But for the Egyptians, failure was not an end. It was a teacher. Sneferu tried again. He moved north to Dashur and built the bent pyramid, a massive structure whose angles shift midway, creating a shape unlike anything the world had seen. Its upper section rises steeply, while its lower portion spreads outward as if embracing the earth. Some say the builders changed the angle after noticing structural weaknesses. Others believe the king wanted a gentler ascent, a symbolic gesture of humility before the heavens. Whatever the reason, the bent pyramid stands today as a testament to experimentation, adaptation, and the Egyptians' refusal to compromise on their vision. And then, as though guided by the lessons of these attempts, Sneferu achieved perfection. The Red Pyramid, a towering, smooth-sided monument rising from the desert in clean geometric lines, its red limestone glowing beneath the sun. This was Egypt's first true pyramid, a declaration of mastery, of stone, of labor, of cosmic order. And through this mastery, Egypt approached the peak of its early power. Under Sneferu and his successors, the centralized state strengthened. Administrative districts, nomes, were formalized across the kingdom. Nomarchs were appointed to oversee regional affairs, irrigation, taxation, storage, and ritual celebrations. Scribes traveled between these districts, recording inventories on rolls of papyrus that crinkled softly beneath their brushes. Their writing evolved. Symbols grew more standardized, more artistic, more capable of capturing the complexities of life. Boat travel flourished. Large wooden vessels with tall sails and sturdy hulls traversed the Nile from delta to southern frontier. Caravans journeyed into Sinai for copper and turquoise expeditions, sailed to the land of Punt to acquire incense, myrrh, and exotic woods. Egypt was learning not only to build, but to reach. Meanwhile, the royal court became a world of its own. Officials served the king body and soul, not through fear, but through a belief that their service contributed to the maintenance of universal balance. The king's palace, though not preserved in stone, would have been vibrant, filled with courtiers, priests, scribes, craftsmen, messengers, and the quiet footfalls of attendants moving through columned halls with baskets of linen, food, and offerings. Rituals multiplied. Festivals marked the turning of seasons and honored gods whose roles reflected the needs of the time. The sun god Ra rose to prominence. The king became his son, his representative, his living image. Kingship was no longer earthly alone. It reached upward toward the sky. And in the reign of Sneferu's son, Khufu, this reaching would take monumental form. At Giza, a plateau of limestone bedrock overlooking the Nile, Khufu began construction of a pyramid so immense that even today, with modern machines and knowledge, its creation remains difficult to comprehend. Millions of limestone blocks were quarried, shaped, and hauled with a precision unmatched in the ancient world. Workers lived in organized settlements near the site, their meals, tools, and schedules carefully managed by administrators. This was not slave labor. It was a national project, a symbolic act of unity performed by a people who believed their king held the world in balance. The Great Pyramid was not simply a tomb. It was an axis, a cosmic center point, aligning Earth with the heavens, king with cosmos, Egypt with eternity. When it was finished, its casing stones gleamed white under the sun, reflecting light so brilliantly that the pyramid could be seen from miles across the desert. It was a beacon, a monument, a prayer carved into stone. And it signaled that Egypt had reached its first great zenith. Beneath this age of pyramids, beneath the monumental ambition, the vast administrative networks, the growing sophistication of art, writing, and ritual, lay the same foundation that had shaped Egypt from the very beginning. The river, the land, the cycles of time, the pursuit of Ma'at, and the calm, steady rise of a people who learned to build eternity from the rhythms of earth and sky. The Great Pyramid did more than redefine architecture. It redefined how Egyptians understood themselves. For the people who lived in its shadow, the pyramid was a daily reminder that they belonged to something vast and enduring. It was the horizon made tangible, a symbol of what human hands, guided by cosmic purpose, could accomplish. Life in the villages surrounding Giza carried the same rhythms as elsewhere: farming, baking, weaving, tending children, tending cattle, tending fields. Yet those rhythms now pulsed within the larger heartbeat of a unified state. The workers' town at Giza was a carefully organized community. Houses of mud brick lined orderly streets. Bakeries churned out thousands of loaves a day. Butchers prepared meat in quantities rarely seen in rural settlements. Cisterns held water brought from the Nile in massive ceramic jars. Administrators kept records on papyrus scrolls stacked neatly in wooden chests. Doctors tended injuries with herbs and poultices passed down through generations. Even in labor, there was care, structure, and a sense of belonging. The workers themselves were not nameless or faceless. Their graffiti, scratches left on stones, show crews with names like Friends of Khufu, Drunkards of Menkaure, or Vigorous Gang of the White Crown. These inscriptions breathe humanity into a project often imagined as cold and grand. They tell us that the people were proud, that they joked, that they built together with a sense of identity. By Khufu's reign, Egypt's administrative network had grown complex. Nomarchs managed regions with precision and ritual duty. They ensured that canals were cleared, granaries stocked, and taxes collected in grain or labor. Scribes traveled constantly. Tall reed brushes tucked behind their ears, papyrus rolls bound with twine under their arms, documenting everything from harvest yields to temple inventories to the number of cattle in a district. Record-keeping was no longer a luxury. It was the nervous system of a growing state. Temples too expanded in scale and role. No longer simple reed structures, they now rose on stone foundations with pillared halls where flickering oil lamps cast warm halos on painted walls. Priests tended sacred animals, recited hymns at dawn, and carried offerings in long, quiet processions that wound through courtyards scented with incense. Inside sanctuaries, statues of gods, crafted from wood, gold, and faience, were adorned with linen and perfume. Their faces gleamed in lamplight, as if watching over the rituals conducted in their honor. To the Egyptians, these gods were not distant forces. They were companions, present in the flood, in the sunrise, in the laughter of children, in the turning of seasons. The king was their mediator, the priests their attendants, the temples their homes. Art, at this time, entered a period of refinement that would become iconic. Craftsmen carved scenes of daily life with delicate precision. Fishermen casting nets, shipwrights building boats, cattle being herded along river trails, scribes reading aloud in shaded courtyards. The beauty lay not in drama, but in detail. To look at these carvings is to glimpse the calm heartbeat of Egypt, a civilization comfortable with itself, confident in its place in the cosmos, and dedicated to preserving the harmony that bound its world together. Under Khufu's successors, Khafre and Menkaure, the Giza Plateau flourished. The second pyramid rose with regal proportion, guarded by the Great Sphinx, a colossal lion with a human face gazing eastward as though greeting the rising sun each morning. Menkaure's pyramid, though smaller, was sheathed in elegant granite and surrounded by chapels, statues, and ceremonial structures. Together, the three pyramids stood like geometric stanzas of a cosmic poem, each line echoing the same message: Egypt endures. Far beyond Giza, the Old Kingdom blossomed. Agriculture thrived under improved irrigation systems. Trade routes stretched deeper into Africa, across Sinai, and along Mediterranean shores. The arts expanded. Jewelry made with turquoise, gold, carnelian, and lapis lazuli displayed intricate patterns reflecting Egypt's belief in symmetry and balance. Most importantly, the concept of Ma'at became the moral and spiritual foundation of Egyptian life. Ma'at guided behavior from the king to the farmer. It shaped laws, rituals, architecture, and diplomacy. It was the lens through which Egyptians viewed every aspect of existence. To live in accordance with Ma'at was to align oneself with the cosmic order, to act with honesty, fairness, temperance, and respect. And because the king was seen as the guardian of this order, his rule was not arbitrary. It was sacred. This belief created stability unmatched in the ancient world. For centuries, Egypt enjoyed peace, prosperity, and an almost unbroken continuity of leadership and culture. This was the age when the foundations of Egyptian identity were set so deeply that they would endure through invasions, dynastic upheavals, and the passing of millennia. This was Egypt as its people saw it: calm, ordered, harmonious, eternal. But even the most stable structures carry within them the seeds of change. As the Old Kingdom progressed, the responsibilities of managing such a vast and intricate society grew ever heavier. Regional governors gained influence, priestly institutions expanded. The king's divine authority, once unquestioned, faced subtle shifts as Egypt's society became more complex. And though the decline would come later, beyond the scope of this tale, the currents of change were beginning to swirl beneath the surface. Yet through all transitions, all evolutions, all uncertainties, one truth remained. Egypt endured because its people believed in balance, in the river's cycles, in the sun's path, in the king's guidance, in the quiet harmony of daily life. It endured because it rose not in violence, but in patience, not in chaos, but in order. Egypt's rise was not a single moment. It was a long, gentle unfolding, a civilization blooming slowly along the banks of a river that never ceased to give life. Even as the Old Kingdom matured, Egypt's identity continued to crystallize in the small, intimate corners of daily life, in the gestures of craftsmen, in the prayers whispered at dawn, in the laughter of children running along the riverbank, in the soft glow of lamps flickering inside mud-brick homes. For all the grandeur of pyramids and palaces, it was in the homes of ordinary Egyptians that the spirit of the civilization truly lived. A typical household was built of sun-dried brick, its walls cool to the touch even in the heat of midday. Inside, woven mats covered the floors. Clay jars lined shelves, holding grain, oil, beer, and fragrant herbs gathered from the fields. The hearth, a small clay oven glowing softly, was the heart of the home, where bread was baked each morning and stews thickened gently by evening. Families rose with the sun. The first light poured over the desert cliffs, turning the sky a soft pink, and women stepped outside to grind grain on stone querns, their movements practiced, rhythmic, almost meditative. Children fetched water from ceramic jars, refilled daily at the river. Men tended animals, mended nets, or checked the irrigation channels that guided the Nile's precious water to their fields. Agriculture remained the foundation of Egyptian life. Fields of emmer wheat and barley stretched along the riverbanks. Their green blades shimmering in the morning breeze, farmers worked in teams, guiding wooden plows pulled by oxen with steady patience. They sowed seeds by hand, casting them in wide arcs over the dark, fertile soil. When harvest season arrived, families moved together through the fields, sickle in hand, bundling stalks into sheaves carried home on donkey carts. Their world was simple, but not crude. It was orderly, intentional, and deeply connected to the cycles that sustained them. In the towns and cities, life flowed with a different rhythm. Markets bustled with activity. fishmongers calling from shaded stalls, potters displaying rows of polished vessels, weavers selling linen dyed with safflower or ochre, scribes walked with confidence, their reed palettes tucked under their arms, ready to record transactions, contracts, or temple inventories. Children darted between stalls, laughing as they chased one another or played with wooden toys carved into the shapes of animals and boats. Musicians filled the air with the soft tones of flutes and the gentle plucking of harps. Incense drifted from doorways, mixing with the scent of spices and the earthy smell of fresh bread. Life was full, not luxurious by modern standards, but rich in meaning, rich in connection, rich in the quiet joys of a society in harmony. And through all of this, the temples remained at the center, spiritual anchors for every community. Within their courtyards, priests tended sacred fires that burned day and night. They cleansed statues of gods in rituals meant to refresh divine presence, washing them with water scented with myrrh and lotus petals before clothing them in fine linen and gold. Festivals punctuated the year, bringing communities together in vibrant, orderly celebration. Some honored harvests, others marked the turning of seasons. Many were dedicated to specific gods, to Hathor's joy, to Horus's protection, to Ra's daily journey across the sky. Processions like rivers of humanity moved through the streets, children holding garlands, musicians playing flutes and drums, priests carrying shrines draped in flowers and cloth, their steps slow, measured, reverent. And at the center of these rituals was the belief that human action could uphold cosmic balance. Ma'at was not just a philosophy. It was a lived practice, present in every offering, every act of kindness, every decision to speak truth or avoid harm. Even in legal disputes, judges invoked Ma'at, asking whether actions maintained harmony or stirred unnecessary chaos. Fairness was not a preference, it was a responsibility. This emphasis on balance extended to the natural world. Egyptians believed that the river's flood reflected the state of society. If the land was harmonious, the river would rise generously. If disorder spread, the flood might falter. In this way, every person, from king to farmer, felt connected to the well-being of the whole. It was this unity of purpose, this shared devotion to harmony, that allowed Egypt to enjoy centuries of prosperity almost unparalleled in ancient history. But the Old Kingdom was not merely a time of stability, it was a time of imagination. Artisans molded clay into forms so elegant that they still evoke awe today. Stoneworkers carved statues with lifelike detail, shoulders relaxed, faces serene, eyes inlaid with quartz to catch the light like living souls. Painters decorated tombs with vibrant scenes of daily activities, not heroic battles, but fishermen casting nets, farmers tending cattle, women grinding grain, families sharing meals. These images were not created for entertainment. They were created to ensure that in eternity, life would continue just as it had on earth, full of order, purpose, and quiet joy. Egyptian belief held that the afterlife was a continuation of the earthly world, if one had lived in accordance with Ma'at. Thus, tombs became preservations of identity, not cold chambers of death, but warm expressions of cherished life. The people of Egypt did not fear death as an abrupt ending. They saw it as another phase in the cycle, like the setting of the sun before dawn returns. This worldview, anchored in calm acceptance, shaped everything they built, everything they believed, everything they passed down. And so Egypt rose, not through conquest or sudden leaps, but through a gentle, steady accumulation of harmony. It rose through patience, through devotion, through a belief that the world was ordered and that human life was meaningful within that order. The calm rise of Egypt was not a moment, it was a way of being. Even as Egypt's achievements reached ever greater heights, the heart of the civilization remained tied to the land that had shaped it from the beginning. For all the monuments, for all the advances in administration, for all the refinement in art and ritual, the soul of Egypt still breathed in the quiet spaces, in the fields at dawn, in the river's gentle murmur, in the hush of desert winds moving across ancient dunes. And it was in these quiet spaces that the next great movement of Egyptian life began, the flowering of community identities within the broad stability of the kingdom. Across the Nile Valley, nomes, regional districts, grew increasingly distinct. Each developed its own patron deities, its own festivals, its own traditions. Some honored falcon gods, some revered cow goddesses, some celebrated crocodile spirits or jackal-bodied guardians of the desert. These regional beliefs did not divide Egypt, they enriched it. For the Egyptians saw no conflict between local devotion and national unity. To them, the world was layered, small truths nested within larger truths, each one essential, each one harmonious. A family might honor a household spirit who watched over the hearth. A village might worship a river deity whose blessings ensured a good flood. A nome might dedicate its greatest festival to a protective goddess whose shrine stood at the district center. And above all these powers stood the great gods of creation, Ra, Hathor, Horus, Osiris, beings whose influence shaped the entire cosmos. Religion was not centralized, nor was it rigid. It adapted to each region, each community, each need. This flexibility allowed Egypt to maintain a spiritual unity that complemented its political unity. Where other civilizations fractured under competing beliefs, Egypt wove diversity into harmony. Even as the state expanded, life for most Egyptians remained grounded in simple, meaningful routines. A child growing up in a small village learned early how to help with chores, feeding goats, fetching water, rolling clay for pottery. He or she might play with little reed boats that drifted in irrigation channels or chase each other through fields while their parents worked. Children learn to read the seasons not from calendars, but from the feel of the air, the color of the river, the call of certain birds returning at predictable times. They learned stories of gods and kings from elders who spoke in calm, measured tones around evening fires. These stories, passed gently across generations, became the threads that held Egypt together. In the cities, life took on a more crowded rhythm. Workshops hummed with activity, cobblers shaping sandals, stonemasons carving lintels, jewelers stringing beads in patterns of turquoise and gold. Scribes sat in shaded courtyards, copying lists or composing letters, while apprentices practiced the art of hieroglyphs on broken pottery shards. These shards, called ostraca, became the paper of everyday life. Quick notes, tallies, practice strokes, jokes, and even small drawings found their way onto these fragments that modern archaeologists would treasure as glimpses into daily existence. And still the river flowed. It carried barges heavy with stone, boats filled with grain, and fishermen hauling nets that glistened with morning catch. Children splashed along its edges, women washed linen in its shallow waters, priests collected river water for purification rituals. The Nile was not only Egypt's lifeline, it was its memory. Every generation watched the same flood rise, the same fields bloom, the same seasons unfold in dependable rhythm. This constancy shaped their sense of time. To the Egyptians, time was not a straight line. It was a cycle of renewal, return, continuation. The sun's daily journey was a metaphor for every human life. Birth, flourishing, decline, renewal. these stages repeated in the heavens and on earth. This worldview made the Egyptians patient, hopeful, confident in continuity. It also shaped their understanding of kingship and immortality. By the later Old Kingdom, the king's spiritual role expanded further. He became not only the son of the sun god, but also the inheritor of a cosmic cycle. In death, he joined the gods to ensure the rising of the sun and the flooding of the Nile. The pyramid texts, the earliest religious writings carved into the chambers of royal tombs, speak to this belief. They describe the king's ascent to the sky, his union with the stars, his rebirth each day with the rising sun. These texts are poetic, calm, filled with imagery of flight, light, and eternal renewal. In them, we see the Egyptian mind at its most serene, comfortable with mystery, unafraid of eternity. But while kings and priests shaped great rituals, the ordinary people continued to live with humility and resilience. A mother sang lullabies to her child as she rocked him in the doorway where the evening breeze drifted in. A father returned from the fields with dust on his hands, but pride in his heart as he looked at the grain stored for the season ahead. A young girl braided her sister's hair, while her grandmother told a story of a goddess who protected children with the gentleness of a cow and the strength of a lioness. These moments, soft, everyday, unrecorded in stone, were the true heartbeat of Egypt. They were the reason Egypt endured far beyond the rise and fall of dynasties and monuments. Because while the pyramids anchored Egypt in eternity, its people anchored Egypt in life. Their devotion to balance, their reverence for cycles, their calm acceptance of time, these qualities ensured that even as the Old Kingdom eventually reached its limits, the spirit of Egypt would continue to rise, fall, and rise again, just as it always had. Even as the Old Kingdom approached its later centuries, the essence of Egyptian life remained steady, quiet, cyclical, deeply connected to land and sky. But beneath this stability, new movements were beginning to stir, subtle shifts in power, new voices emerging, new needs in a society that had grown vast and interconnected. These changes did not appear suddenly. They emerged like the first ripples on a calm stretch of river, gentle, almost invisible, yet signaling deeper currents below. One of the most significant shifts was the rising importance of regional leaders, the nomarchs. These administrators, appointed originally to assist the king in managing provincial affairs, began to accumulate influence. They oversaw irrigation, organized local labor, allocated grain supplies, and settled disputes within their districts. As Egypt grew more prosperous, these duties expanded. Their temples grew larger, their estates became wealthier. Their tombs, carved into cliffs or built in stone, became elaborate expressions of local pride and identity. And unlike the king who ruled from afar, nomarchs lived among their people. Villagers saw them regularly, at festivals, in markets, in the fields during inspections of irrigation canals. Their presence was immediate, familiar, reassuring. Over time, the bond between nomarchs and their communities strengthened, creating pockets of regional loyalty that both supported the kingdom and subtly shifted the balance of power. Yet even as local authority grew, the ideological heart of Egypt, Ma'at, remained unshaken. Every official, from palace steward to regional governor, was expected to embody Ma'at, fairness, truth, balance, care for the vulnerable, honesty in records, restraint in judgment. This expectation kept Egypt stable even as the social framework evolved. In many ways, the rising political complexity reflected the growing complexity of religious thought. For centuries, Egypt's spiritual world had been a tapestry of local gods and traditions. But with unification and the administrative reach of the state, these local traditions began to converge. The great gods, Ra, Hathor, Horus, Ptah, slowly absorbed aspects of older local deities, creating layered identities with multiple roles, multiple mythologies, multiple meanings. Egyptians did not see contradiction in these complexities. To them, the divine was vast, flexible, capable of appearing in many shapes and forms. Thus, a goddess could be a nurturing mother in one city, a fierce protector in another, and a cosmic principle in a third, without losing coherence. This fluidity gave Egyptian religion a timeless resilience. Even funerary beliefs evolved. What began as a royal privilege, an afterlife filled with abundance and guided by sacred rituals, slowly expanded to include more of the population. Tomb paintings of nobles show scenes once reserved for kings, offerings carried by servants, rituals of purification, the deceased receiving gifts from gods of the afterlife. This democratization of belief did not weaken royal authority. It reflected a deepening faith in the continuity of life, a belief that all Egyptians, if they lived in Ma'at, deserved renewal. One of the most profound developments of this era was the evolution of the afterlife god, Osiris. Originally a local deity of vegetation and seasonal renewal, Osiris gradually rose to become the lord of the dead, the symbol of rebirth, the ruler of the next world. His myth, telling of death, dismemberment, restoration, and triumph over chaos, resonated deeply with a people who saw death not as an ending, but as transformation. Osiris's rise reflected Egypt's own spiritual evolution, a movement from viewing death as the king's exclusive journey to understanding it as a universal passage. Ordinary Egyptians, who once imagined their afterlives as quiet continuations of earthly tasks, now envisioned a more structured realm overseen by Osiris, whose judgment was fair, measured, and rooted in Ma'at. In this emerging vision, the heart of the deceased was weighed against the feather of truth, a metaphor so gentle, so poetic, that it remains one of the most enduring images of the ancient world. A heart light with honesty balanced the feather and granted entry into eternal life. A heart heavy with wrongdoing tilted the scale and was lost. It was not fear that guided this belief, but clarity. Live in balance, and balance will guide you. This philosophy shaped the ethical backbone of Egyptian society. Meanwhile, daily life continued in steady rhythm. Craftsmen reached new heights in skill and innovation. Carved wooden statues captured lifelike expressions, eyes inlaid with quartz that glimmered as though alive copper tools improved, allowing for finer stonework. Artists studied proportion and posture, creating forms that combined ideal beauty with a quiet sense of realism. In workshops, apprentices learned from masters in an unbroken chain of tradition. A young carver might spend years perfecting the curve of a lotus flower before ever touching the face of a statue. A painter might practice the delicate gradient of blue and green used to depict Nile water long before being trusted with a tomb wall. This devotion to craft was not merely technical, it was spiritual. To carve stone was to shape eternity. To paint a ritual scene was to ensure its perpetual renewal. To write a hieroglyph was to give thought permanent life. Every stroke, every mark, every line was an act of offering. Across Egypt's expanding towns and villages, families continued to thrive within this stability. Meals were shared under the soft glow of oil lamps. Children learned to swim in calm river inlets. Fishermen cast nets that sparkled with droplets in the morning sun. Farmers sang as they harvested grain to the rhythmic beat of wooden flails. Life was not grandiose, it was steady, predictable, comforting. And it was precisely this steadiness, this deep generational trust in order and harmony, that allowed Egypt to rise so calmly, so gradually, so enduringly. By the height of the Old Kingdom, Egypt had become a civilization of extraordinary balance, between earth and sky, between life and death, between local traditions and national identity, between change and continuity. It was a civilization built not only with stone, but with patience, not only with power, but with belief, not only with kings, but with millions of hands moving in quiet harmony. And though the centuries ahead would bring challenges, shifts in climate, economic strain, and political decentralization, the spirit that had guided Egypt from the beginning would endure. A calm certainty that life, like the Nile, moves in cycles. That balance can always be restored. That harmony is possible between land and people, people and gods, life and eternity. This was the foundation upon which Egypt rose, and through all its ages, Old Kingdom, Middle Kingdom, New Kingdom, this gentle, ordered heart would beat unchanged. As the Old Kingdom reached its later generations, the achievements of Egypt had woven themselves into a vast tapestry, one made not only of stone and ceremony, but of countless small threads held by ordinary lives. Yet no civilization, not even one built on harmony, is immune to change. And it was through gentle shifts, barely noticeable at first, that Egypt began transitioning toward a new phase of its long history. The climate grew subtly drier. The Nile's floods, once reliably generous, became more unpredictable. Some years the waters rose too low, leaving fields thirsty and harvests thin. Other years they swelled too high, overwhelming canals and sweeping away carefully tended plots. These fluctuations in a land where agriculture was lifeblood required careful management. Granaries were stocked more cautiously. Scribes recorded not only abundance but scarcity. Nomarchs worked tirelessly to balance local resources and prepare for lean seasons. The kingdom endured. But the strain was felt. Meanwhile, the responsibilities of the central government continued to expand. Temples grew wealthier as offerings accumulated. Priests took on broader roles as caretakers of estates, managers of labor, keepers of sacred knowledge. Their influence increased, not through ambition, but through the natural growth of their duties. Likewise, nomarchs found themselves managing more land, more workers, more complex irrigation networks. Their administrative expertise became essential to keeping regions stable in times of uncertain floods. The king, still revered as the guardian of Ma'at, relied more heavily on these regional authorities to ensure that the kingdom's harmony remained intact. And though this delegation was practical and effective, it subtly shifted the balance of power. Where once authority flowed from king to district, it now flowed in a more intricate pattern, a network of cooperation, negotiation, and shared responsibility. This was not a crisis, it was an evolution, and it reflected the sophistication of a civilization capable of adapting without abandoning its foundational values. Egypt remained unified, its culture flourished. Its art continued to deepen in beauty and nuance. Statues grew more lifelike, with bodies rendered in poised stillness and faces calm as the river at dusk. Tomb reliefs depicted scenes of daily life with astonishing clarity. Herdsmen leading cattle, gardeners tending ponds of lotus, craftsmen shaping wood, women preparing feasts. These images, vibrant, detailed, tender, were not simply decorative. They were affirmations of a world worth preserving. Even as the political landscape shifted, the spiritual landscape grew richer. Osiris's role in the afterlife expanded into a full theology. The concept of judgment became central. The weighing of the heart, the feather of truth, the eternal fields where the righteous would dwell in peace and abundance. This vision resonated not only with nobles, but with common people. For the first time in history, ordinary Egyptians believed that their lives and their moral choices had cosmic significance. This moral dimension deepened their connection to Ma'at. Balance was no longer just an earthly principle. It became a spiritual compass. Meanwhile, in cities and workshops, the craft traditions that had shaped Egypt for centuries continued to evolve. Copper tools grew sharper. Carpentry advanced as artisans built furniture with complex joints and elegant curves. Faience, that shimmering blue-green ceramic, was perfected, glazed to resemble precious stones. Jewelry designs grew intricate, incorporating gold wirework and colored beads arranged in precise geometric patterns. Trade routes expanded further down the Nile and across the desert. Caravans brought incense, resin, antelope skins, and exotic woods. Sailors returned from coastal journeys with oils, wine, and pottery from distant lands. These interactions enriched Egypt without disrupting its core identity. For even as Egypt explored new materials and ideas, it remained anchored by the same quiet certainties that had guided it since the earliest farmers tilled the riverbank. The sun still rose over desert cliffs in a wash of gold and rose. The river still shimmered under the afternoon light, its surface broken by the soft splash of oars or the graceful glide of birds. Families still gathered on rooftops in the evening to share stories and watch cool breezes roll in from the water. This continuity, this calmness, was the secret strength of Egypt. Even as the Old Kingdom gradually transitioned toward a more complex and decentralized structure, Egyptian society held firmly to its values of harmony, order, and cyclical renewal. The seeds of change were present, but so were the seeds of endurance. In time, the first intermediate period would bring challenges: political fragmentation, regional autonomy, and social shifts. But the spirit of Egypt would not break, because it was built not on conquest, not on fear, not on the rise and fall of individual kings, but on a collective belief in balance. It was built on the patience of farmers, the devotion of priests, the skill of artisans, the precision of scribes, the quiet resilience of families who rose each morning with the sun. This belief had carried Egypt from scattered villages to unified kingdoms, from reed huts to pyramids of stone, from simple rituals to a theology of cosmic harmony. And it would carry Egypt through every age that followed. The calm rise of ancient Egypt was never a single era. It was a way of life, a worldview that embraced the slow, steady unfolding of time, a worldview that found meaning in continuity, beauty in order, and eternity in the quiet flow of the Nile. And so Egypt rose, gently, enduringly, with a grace matched by no other ancient world.